Alrighty then. Pythagoras is what we are looking at. Okay, so Pythagoras is all to do with the lengths of either the shorter sides or the longer sides of a right angle triangle. And that's the key thing, a right angle triangle. Okay, there are ways to find lengths of other triangles using either angles and lengths or other bits, and that's called trigonometry. Some of that we'll be looking at a later date. So Pythagoras, there is a formula that many people sort of know just by it just being told to them, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Okay, others know it as a squared plus b squared equals h squared. Okay, and we'll come on to what that means in a minute. Okay, so if we look at the principle behind it, there is a really good video. You may have seen it in your lessons in the past. Particularly, I know Miss Grundy's, I think, was the one that showed it to me a while back, but it's all to do with water and the area. Okay, so in a triangle, see if I can, no, this will not allow me to draw a right angle triangle. Okay, so in a triangle with a right angle, we have got, I was called B, the base. We've got then our shortest side, which is A, and then we've got this longest side, which is called your hypotenuse. Okay, the hypotenuse is always the longest side of the triangle, and it is always diagonally opposite the right angle. I appreciate that it is not drawn accurately there, but you'll have to forgive me for that. Okay, so your right angle hypotenuse always diagonally opposite it. What ends up happening is the a squared plus the b squared starts to talk about the area. So if we drew a square out of here, the area of this square multiplied by, let me just zoom out a bit so we can see it, multiplied then by the area of the base would then add together, which is the a squared plus b squared, then to equal to the area off of this. Okay, but we don't want an area, so then there's another step which is then called the square root. So we then square root to give us the answer. Okay, and we'll talk about each step as we go through it. But that's the principle. Again, if you want me to show you that video, I can show you that, because it is definitely better than this low quality drawing that I have then just produced. Okay, so let's go back a bit. Okay, and we'll look at these questions. Okay, so if we just zoom in a bit and we see the question. Whoa, way too much. How do I move the page? No idea. Okay, so if we've got our formulas, then what we want to now do is then use them. Okay, so if we look at this first question, we have got the 3.3 and we've got the 5.6. So the first thing to be doing is identifying, do I have either a base, a height, or is it a hypotenuse? I'm trying to get my words out. Okay, so for this, I would start off straight away with going from my right angle and looking across. Okay, so there is the hypotenuse. Okay, so that's what I'm then looking for. So I then know that I've got my base and I've got my shortest side. So I'm then going to come to a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Again, some people like to use h squared just because it reminds them that it's a hypotenuse. That's okay. Okay, so what I've got then is 3.3 squared, add 5.6 squared, and then that's going to give me an answer. So going to use my calculator. Going to write it out in 5.6 squared equals, I don't want the fractional part, I want my decimal answer, 4.2.5. I'm not going to do any rounding at this stage, but I'm going to leave the value on my calculator screen, and then I am going to now square root it. So at the minute, just like my high quality drawing earlier, we're currently at the area. Okay, so this is, because it's still squared, that is then the area of a square based off of the hypotenuse. What we now want is to then square root it. We square root it because on a square, it's length times width, which is the same number. So that's like doing 5 squared, for example. So the inverse of squaring is square rooting. So we're going to do the same thing. And then that will then tell us the length. So I'm going to press square root, answer button, equals 13/2, which is 6.5 centimeters. Okay. Before I move on to the next question, I'm going to double check something. Hold on, I need to cough. Done. Right. The hypotenuse should always be the longest length. Okay. So 6.5. So if I now check this, 3.3, 5.6, 6.5, good. So just by checking that, I can see straight away that I have found the longest length. And then I can then just check out any other working out just to make sure. Okay, next one then. So if I now select all of this and then clear it, get rid of use as well. First step that I'm going to do, as always, is I'm just going to double check on my picture, what have I got? So again, I'm going to come to my right angle. Okay, and I've got my hypotenuse this time. So I've got a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I now know that I've got my shortest side, 1.5, which is my a. What's it off there? A. But I'm looking for my b. So 1.5 squared add b squared equals 3.9 squared. Okay, so I've already got the hypotenuse. So what I now need to do is find one of the shorter sides, which is that baseline of that x. So instead of doing a squared plus b squared equals c squared, I'm now going to have to do that inverse. So I'm now going to take my c squared, and I'm now going to subtract off the 1.5 squared. So the c squared subtract the a squared. Okay, again, I'm going to type it into a calculator. So I've now got 3.9 squared subtract 1.5 squared. And then to really kind of reiterate, it has to be c squared, okay? It has to be that biggest side subtracted off one of the smaller sides, okay? That then leaves me with this area for the b squared. What I now need to do is, just like the other one, I need to square root it. So square root, so I'm going to press on my calculator, square root answer equals 18.5, which is 3.6. Okay, so x is then equal to 3.6. I'm going to do my checks again, and I'm going to say, right, okay, I've got my shortest side is 1.5. The length I've found for b is 3.6, and then my hypotenuse is 3.9. So again, there's a mental check there for me to say 3.6 centimeters is a good answer because it is not as long as the hypotenuse, which is good because it shouldn't be. Right. You've now got multiple other questions to look at. Press the wrong button. So you've got multiple other questions to look at, whether or not they are the longest or the shortest side. But each time, doesn't matter if the triangle is upside down, left, right, rotated in any other way, my starting point, I would always be looking at, right, find my right angle, draw across. Find my right angle, draw across. find my right angle, draw across. Okay, so that I can always then identify, right, I'm trying to find the hypotenuse. Okay, this one, I've got my hypotenuse. This question, I've got my hypotenuse. So then when I'm writing it out, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, I can then place things in the right place. So for this third question here, I can then be thinking, right, okay, so I've need to find my hypotenuse. So I've got A, I've got B. The next one across, I've got my A, I'm looking for my B. So then I can then start to substitute things into the right column. So once I've substituted it in, so like this one, 4.8 squared add 5.5 squared equals c squared, I can then start to think about, right, I know it's got to be an addition because I'm trying to find my answer. Okay, but then for the next one, go back a bit more. So for this third one, I'm going to say, right, I've got my 2.7 squared. I don't know what my b value is, so I'm going to leave that as b squared, but I do know what my hypotenuse is, the c squared. So at this time, I know that I'm going to have to do my inverse. Always, 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 we will then square root that answer up from here, because that will then tell us a length rather than an area. Okay, and that's hypotenuse. No, that's Pythagoras in a nutshell. Okay, ta-da.